Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you're here for Intiman Theater's event, Black Theater Beyond the Politics of Representation. We'll start in about 1 minute. Thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you for that. There's too many things going on right now.
Okay, can I help you?
And we asked folks, if possible, just to mute your microphones, and we'll have time later for Q&A.
So here I come.
Okay.
All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to Intiman Theater's event, Black Theater Beyond the Politics of Representation with Stacey McCormick and Wendell Woods. We're so excited to have you all here today. My name is Jasmine Mahmoud. I am the president of Intiman Theater, and I'm so happy that you all are here today. We're going to start our event with a land acknowledgement. Intiman Theater acknowledges that we gather in community on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself, its First Nations, and those who have gathered here since time immemorial. I invite folks to introduce themselves in the chat, where they're coming from, especially the Indigenous lands on which they're on at any time. So thanks again all for being here. A little bit about myself. In addition to being board president of Intiman Theater, I'm also faculty at Seattle University, where my teaching and research engages broadly theater, race, politics, and space. So I'm really, really excited about this discussion that we're going to have tonight. A little bit of protocol. We've been doing this for almost a year, y'all, so I imagine all of y'all have this together. But we ask you to keep your mic on mute. We ask you also to view in speaker view as opposed to gallery view to best see everyone. And then no hate speech. If there's any hate speech, we'll expel you from this conversation. And we're doing that to really foster a respectful dialogue tonight. So a little bit about this event tonight. I'm going to introduce our amazing speakers, talk a little bit about the history of African-American theater and theater and race in the United States. And then we have 3 great questions to frame their contributions to this conversation. So I will get started. And first I'm going to introduce Stacey McCormick. So Stacey McCormick, PhD, is an associate professor of English, comparative race and ethnic studies, and women and gender studies at Texas Christian University. She is the author of Staging Black Fugitivity, Ohio State University Press 2019, which I all encourage you all to buy, which examines how contemporary Black drama represents and engages with slavery. In addition to her work in Black drama and performance, she researches and writes on corporality, visuality, and life writing in Black women's expressive culture. She recently edited the special issue Toni Morrison, an adaptation for college literature, and she is developing a manuscript in process entitled Notes on Creating Livable Futures, Black Motherhood, Medical Inhumanity, and Reimagining Care, which takes up Black women's critical engagement via text and performance with obstetric racism and the medical industrial complex. I know a lot of folks who have cameras off, but I'd love just to give a warm welcoming applause to Stacey McCormick for being here. And then next, I'd love to introduce Wendell Woods. Wendell Woods is a playwright, scholar, and educator. As a theater artist, his work explores the topics of race, gender, identity, community, and memory. His 10-minute play, The Black and White Minstrel Show, has been produced in Chicago, San Diego, Boston, Los Angeles, and New York City. His full-length plays include Johnny May's Soul Kitchen, Skylark Dreams, A Bronzian Tale, Harold and I, and Aaliyah in Underland. Wood's research interests are in the fields of hip-hop theater, dis-aesthetics, narratology, Blackness and performance, as well as themes of death and rebirth, identity, gender, and slang. Currently, he is an assistant professor of theater arts at the University of Puget Sound. So let's all give a warm welcome to Wendell Woods. And so before we kind of get started, I'd love to turn it over to Stacey and Wynn just to share some opening remarks. So Stacey, I'm going to call on you first to share any opening remarks for us tonight.
No problem. Thank you so much, Jasmine and Wesley and Intiman. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here. I have missed engaging more intentionally in theater spaces, given our current circumstances. So this is something that I've been looking forward to, and I'm very glad to be in the space with everyone.
Thanks so much, Stacie. And then Wend, I'd love to turn it over to you for any opening remarks.
Certainly. Hello. I'll keep my remarks pretty brief because you'll hear too much of me later when we tackle some of these questions that kind of outline our conversation. But I want to voice my appreciation to everyone that made this possible and for inviting me to be part of this panel. Thank you to Wesley and members of Intimate Theater for hosting this event. Many thank yous to Dr. Jasmine Mahmoud for the invitation and handling all the logistics, which get more and more difficult the more kind of virtual we get. So I appreciate your patience. And to my co-panelist, Professor Stacey Mccormick, a scholar, I'm quickly and enthusiastically trying to become better familiarized with her work on fugitivity, Blackness, and the long list of theoretical and scholarly approaches that were mentioned. And of course, thanks to everyone that's joining us virtually. I look forward to engaging these conversations and maybe entertaining questions later after the event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wend and Stacie. I'm really happy that you're here. So I know some folks are joining. Just a little bit of an overview. I'm going to give a little brief introduction, then I have 3 questions prepared for our panelists. After that time, we'll have about 15-20 minutes for questions from the audience that we encourage folks to put into the chat. So we're going to get started. And thanks all again for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I wanted to start today, before we get into these questions, thinking about the history of Black theater in the United States, but also the histories of theater and race and how those things kind of entangle with each other. Often when Black theater is talked about and kind of the origins of Black theater are talked about, many folks cite the African Grove Theater, which was the first documented African-American theater in the United States. It was founded by William Henry Brown, pictured in the upper left in New York City. They put on a lot of Shakespeare plays, including Othello and Richard III, which is represented by the playbill on the right. But also because they were Black theater existing during that time, during racism, and during kind of these large anti-Black regimes, the theater moved around a lot. So it existed in New York City, but it moved a lot throughout kind of lower Manhattan because of threats from police, threats from white mobs. And so thinking about this theater that's putting on kind of quote unquote classical work, putting on Shakespeare plays, putting on works written by Williams Henry Brown, but also a theater that has to be itinerant, has to be moving a lot because of anti-Blackness that's existing so much in the United States. So we can think about that. What does that mean to think about that when we think about the origins of Black theater? A second thing when we think about Black theater, I want us to think about Frederick Douglass, who was enslaved, and he wrote his really famous autobiography. And he traveled around the United States reading excerpts from this autobiography. When he grew up as a slave, it was in many places seen as illegal to be literate as a Black slave, and many Black people who endeavored to read were beaten and brutally hurt for this. And so part of Frederick Douglass's project in talking about his life as an enslaved person was to read his story aloud. And we can think about that oral tradition also as part of African-American theater. I think where we get to the rub and kind of where our conversation, where Black theater meets up with this rub, is thinking about theater and race in the United States. And whenever I teach about race at Seattle University, be it in an arts class or not, I always talk about Blackface minstrelsy. In the early 1830s, a white actor named Thomas Danforth Rice, he was based in New York City. The lore has it is that he traveled to the South. He supposedly saw a Black man perform, and something about this inspired him to burn a cork, smear it on his face, and start performing in these vaudeville acts that became Blackface minstrelsy performance. And Blackface minstrelsy is very, very important when we think about theater and when we think about race more broadly, especially for 2 reasons. One, because it started as white people performing Blackness and white people making their own representations of Blackness. And so we can think about, what does that mean for Black people? Pictured on the right is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was the most performed theater play in the 19th century in the United States. And the Black characters were performed in blackface. So thinking about white representations of Black people. But second, blackface minstrelsy became the most popular form of entertainment in the 19th century. And so when we think about theater and race, we have to think about these things together, about white actors performing ideas of Blackness, and this being ubiquitous. You go to a tavern, you get a beer, and you see someone on stage performing in blackface minstrelsy. So I want to give a little bit of that background for us to kind of set the conversation today. What does it mean, especially for Black people, Black actors, Black theater artists, to have these burdens of representations placed on their body because of this long history of racial representation? Two more quick things, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I also just want to name about the work of Black theater artists. In the early 20th century, many Black playwrights, especially Black women playwrights, begin to write what's often called anti-lynching plays. Because lynching was so ubiquitous across the United States, lynching especially of Black men and Black people without recourse, a lot of Black artists use writing plays to express the horrors of this. These plays were often staged in the living room of Black women. So just thinking about that. And then later, starting after World War II, thinking about late 20th century theater, from Lorraine Hansberry's Raising the Sun to For Colored Girls, to pictured in the lower right is Anna Devere Smith's work. So with that, kind of that opening, I want to turn it over to our panelists, who are going to really start us off in a really, really great conversation. And so we have 3 questions. And the first question, I'll read this, it's also on this screen. What are the limits of the politics of representation for Black theater artists? How do we keep the critical force of a Black perspective in the theater? How do you consider the politics of representation versus the changing dynamics of theater? And I'm going to turn it over to Wend first.
Unmute my mic. Thank you. So I want to work backwards through each of the maybe smaller questions that make up this very large and important yet complicated question. So kind of to begin in reverse, how do you consider the politics of representation versus the change in dynamics of theater? And I'm thinking about this question. I was reminded of my early experiences as a Black playwright, and how I was mesmerized, and still am, by August Wilson and Susan Lloyd Parks. When I won't say young because I feel I still am, but when I was a more youngish playwright, there seemed to be like a representational void between Wilson and Parks. And on many levels, it's wonderful to have these representational and aesthetic polarities. And even imagining myself in the interstitial spaces between them is a rich privilege and a intimidating location. One that I still aspire to inhabit. But for a while, it felt like this was the entirety of Black theater, its voices, its perspectives. Regionally, in terms of production, and educationally, in terms of the canon. So I think one thing we are seeing more and more of is the inclusion of other Black voices that represent the rich diversity of matters of Black life and Black lives. For example, Katori Hall, Lynn Nottage, Brandon Jacob Jenkins, Terrell McCraney, Dominique Marceau, Danja Love, Erica Dickerson, Dispenza, Robert O'Hara, and of course, many, many, many more besides them. So I'm thinking having these voices with and alongside Wilson and Parks, which is different than or as opposed to them, is essential to broadening the creative and I guess critical approaches of how we think and do theater in a way that cites and revises older traditions while working to have Black theater be what Daniel Banks suggests of hip hop theater, drama of the now. And so I want to kind of also think about Black theater of the now, for it's always now, everything is now, as Toni Morrison's character Beloved observed, and how this now and Black theater aesthetics are all bound up with not only time, but also space and spaces of creation, contestation, repetition and revision? Will we become bound and unbounded in our search for ways to tell our stories, as well as to reflect and study the ways and of those telling, this kind of self-reflection as we do what we do as theater artists. And so whether we think of a Black play as deep, armed to the teeth, or that a Black play does not exist, or every play is a Black play, or a Black play is a white play, when the lights go out, if we follow the Black math of Susan Laurie Parks, we might say that Black theater is bound in all sense of the word. As Bynum states in Joe Turner's Come and Gone, you can't bind what don't cling. And I want to conclude by binding the original question with Winter's observation below, that the incredible inventiveness of Black culture is not to be understood outside the imperative task of transformation. And I want to conclude by saying, or at least this section, Black theater must have space and support to transform in order to be transformative on and off the stage. And so how do we continue to make and shape space for this and other imperative tasks? And what do we do if space is refused, if we're guarded at the gate? And how do we reinvent space or reinvent the tools to reshape space for our recreation? So that's kind of the first question I tackled. I have to break it down. That's kind of how I have to do large questions. So the second part is, how do we keep the critical force of Black perspective in theater that gets presented in the theater? And so I want to open with a quote by Bell Hooks. In Black Looks, Race, and Representation, Hooks states, within commodity culture, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up a dull dish that is mainstream white culture. So admittedly, I'm pessimistic that this side dishing of Black plays, this Emeril Lagasse kind of banning of flavorful color into a season won't, that I'm skeptical that will change easily. And I'm skeptical because we often see like supplemental sentences and mission statements in support of whatever the next hashtag is. I'm just not sure if that will keep Black artists from arriving at an institution and realizing that they are both a guest and an item on the menu. So while I'm not sure of a corrective for this, I do have something of an analysis of what might add to this kind of consumption of Black culture without any type of gain or substance. And I want to attribute it to this phenomena of like an appearance and then disappearance of an approved Black play in a, quote, traditional season. And my analysis centers on what I and others have observed as the dominant culture's philic bond to Black style and aesthetic, and the phobic response to Black politics, suffering, and demands. In other words, a certain fondness and uncritical love for Black performances. And I'm thinking about like the notion of Black bodies in motion, but always within like the context of a frame or a stage. A colleague of mine at University of Puget Sound here talks about it as a type of capturing through choreography of Black bodies and movement. And I'm thinking about that alongside the irrational fear and aversion to digging at the roots of Black thought and applying pressure to the very point where things may fall apart. So one way to perhaps get around this problem I've tried to outline above is the work to have one's commitment to anti-racism be deeper than a diversity spot in a season or an addendum to a mission statement, but actually embedded into the DNA of an institution. How do we do this? Well, that's the difficult part. But for me, it comes down to a political and philosophical difference between looking at Black people and looking with Black people. There are some institutions that I feel are heading in this direction. From what I've seen of Intiman, this event being an example, there's a serious and sustained effort to, as their mission statement quote says, quote, use the power of story and education to activate dialogue, confront inequity, and build collective joy. And as their website mentioned, such a task takes courage, imagination. There was also an initiative at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival titled the FAIR Program, originally created by Timothy Bond. And I think it is currently run by Sharifa Joka. Their mission and vision is to achieve equity within the Oregon Shakespeare Festival while creating, participating in, and supporting efforts that sustain equity throughout the field of American theater. I think this is an attempt to embed diverse voices, perspective, talents, stories, and political demands into the foundation of what they do in the community and in theater at large. So in closing of this part, there might be great sacrifice in moving from looking at to moving to looking with. But for me, it is key to maintaining what the question asserts is the critical force of the Black perspective. As for what are the limits of the politics of representation for Black theater artists, I think the previous questions and my attempts at answers touched on them, but I want to use an analogy to define these limitations a little bit more. So in my own work, I use the example of a play that uses hip hop as a type of aesthetic flair versus a play that has hip hop rooted in its dramaturgy. A play that uses hip hop might have the performance or performative stylistic elements of hip hop, but it usually will not have the critical force. In other words, it won't think hip hop, its burdens, and its long tradition of Black subversion and critique. It will forget to remember hip hop's fifth element of knowledge and cultural overstanding. In terms of theater, the problem with a diversity spot is that actors of color appear and disappear, come and go. What if the goal is not solely to appear or to represent, but to immerse, to root, and to transform? I want to suggest that if your theater's practices and politics are not altered by an engagement with hip hop aesthetics, the theater most likely only used or sprinkled hip hop onto the status quo. The same might be said for an inclusion of a Black play in a season. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendell. I really appreciate so many of your invocations, including thinking with Black artists. I'm going to turn it over to Stacie to also engage this first question about the politics of representation.
Okay, thank you. So in thinking about this question and so much of what Wen has offered, I hope not to be too repetitive, but I think we're in the same mode of thinking. So hopefully it can be additive to what we've already heard. And I really appreciate it because it's already sparking so many things in me. But you'll see an equation up here. Do not be mistaken. I am not a math person. I am in the theater and English department and all the places where no math is involved for a reason. But I do know that in many ways, what we come up against in representing Blackness or thinking about the politics of representation is that we're often kind of wedded or bound up to these formulas, right? Or recipes, if you will. And so I was thinking about what it means to go toward a mathematics of Black freedom that's calculated through the political force of Black embodiment, right? How do we continue to push against these expectations that are derived from familiar expectations of what Blackness should be on stage, as opposed to capturing the fullness of Black experience? And you can go to the next slide. And so in thinking about this, and this quote in many ways anchors my own book, Staging Black Fugitivity. Alice Childress was in conversation with Toni Morrison doing an interview, and the interviewer asked Alice Childress and Toni Morrison what themes they saw as being dominant in the 1970s. And you can see she's quoted here saying, "I think all Black writers, whether they intended to or not, have been writing about not being free." We've heard that millions of times. The trouble is with us is that we're not free. And I feel like this resonance when we think about the 1970s, And today it's painfully resonant that this is still a question for contemporary Black playwrights, that this exploration of how to get free through drama, through the stage, is an ongoing process. And you can go to the next slide. And so for me, I was really intrigued by how, in many ways, contemporary Black playwrights are breaking the formula. They are not adhering to what is expected, which led me to my own inquiry about what was going on with all of these plays and the rise of plays about slavery. And what is in that genre that's so attractive right now in kind of articulating kind of contemporary Black consciousness or thought about, you know, belonging or any of those things, about freedom. And what was surprisingly refreshing is that in just about every instance of plays that I examined, I always found that they kind of do a bait and switch in some ways, in the sense that you go into the theater expecting a particular kind of story about slavery, but then you come out having been shifted, having been provoked, and you don't get what's expected and what's familiar. And I feel like that kind of intervention is what we've seen Black playwrights do in an ongoing way. And so you can see from the images, the first image is Lydia Diamond's Harriet Jacobs, where she employs or uses an all-Black cast to even depict white characters. And she was intentional about that in saying that she wanted us to critique or think about the politics of race and how it's constructed in theater, but also the politics of casting and all of the other dynamics that come with theater making, right? So she's using the site of slavery as a space to think critically about Black representation in theater, which is one of the central definitions that I offer in the book in terms of performing fugitivity, which is this idea of subversive, radical, and experimental performances of Black artistic and political freedom at the site of slavery. And so in the upper right, you'll see Brandon Jacobs Jenkins and Octoroon, and that play in particular in its engagement with Dion Boucicault's The Octoroon, and how it flips that narrative as well. And it opens with a meditation on what it means to be a quote unquote Black playwright. And that there's a lot of angst about just how Blackness is expected to show up on stage, and how wedded people are to these particular understandings of Blackness, and how hard it is to break out of them because of issues of the market, which are something I'm going to talk about later, but are incredibly ironic considering that Black performance on an auction block is bound up in these histories of, you know, trafficking people. And so we have this mark of the marketplace that Susan Laurie Parks talks about in Father Comes Home from the Wars. How do we escape the mark of the marketplace when it comes to Black representations of Blackness on stage, and divorce this kind of consumptive relationship that many, you know, audience members and theater goers have when gazing and engaging with Black folks. And the lower image is Dred Scott's Decision. The performance artist, he is also flipping the equation in terms of artists or people who have come to see a particular narrative about Dred Scott. But then we get a narrative that carries us from the civil rights era into the present to show how those same legacies endure and forces the audience to reckon with that. You can go to the next slide. And so this kind of brings us to this ongoing conundrum we have that Susan Laurie Parks so powerfully identified in her essay, An Equation for Blackness on Stage, is that you in many ways are expected to kind of adhere to a certain kind of representation, a certain kind of formula that then produces a familiar kind of Blackness that can easily be, legible to audiences. And I think the challenge, and what Susan Lloyd Parks tells us in her quote, is that we need to think about what happens with the X, and what happens in that space of possibility, where, you have audiences who are encouraged to understand and see and discuss dramas in terms of something other than what she calls the same old shit, which is highly important, because we can get kind of caught up in these cycles of familiarity, and we can trap Black artists, Black playwrights and performers into particular kinds of representations of Blackness. You can go to the next one. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the plays I examined in the book, Tonya Barfield's Blue Door, actually features a math professor. So in thinking about this kind of overt recognition of, this kind of way that the ongoing expectations and that formula perpetuates itself, she's thinking about how to disrupt that through this central figure. And they describe life as kind of this Euclidean universe. There we go with the math words, but this idea of the past forever vying for the present. And so her central figure is trying to escape or rewrite that equation, and the blue door represents in many ways the possibility of doing so, of disrupting the past hold on the present, and how to kind of break that. And so finally, I'm thinking about these meditations and what these playwrights are showing us as disrupting these equations, and how that's critical, because in the formula, simply adding Blackness and stirring, right, is not sufficient for any transformational change. We must think beyond the familiar and go toward the unfamiliar. And so I'm reminded of Angela Davis, who talks about the limits of representation as well. And she basically explains that if we're only aiming for superficial, surface level inclusion, we'll end up with a difference that makes no difference. And I think that that's highly true for us in thinking about how we engage with Blackness in the theater.
Thanks so much, Stacie. I did a with the Angela Davis quote of the
Right.
difference that makes no difference. And I so appreciate, especially with this beautiful image of this production, you're framing through formulas and thinking about the formulas that actually are put on all of our bodies, the ways in which theater might amplify that, but also the ways in which theater production programming might disrupt that, and especially in anti-oppressive, anti-racist ways.
Yes.
We're going to move to the second question. A lot of text on the screen. I know in my work, I call highly upon two Black scholars, Salome Shatila and Richard Eiton, both kind of cultural theorists, and they have written about how for Black people, because Black people have been excluded from full citizenship in the United States, the arts and culture often become a place to express Black citizenship, to express kind of their civic belonging through aesthetic and cultural means. And so with that, I asked this question of Stacie and Wend: how does theater act as a civic project for Black people? How does Black theater dialogue with the ways that the civic promise has remained unfulfilled for Black people? How has theater acted as an often unrecognized site for Black citizenship that is also powerful because it serves as a communal gathering? And I'm going to turn it over to Stacie first with this question.
Yes, thank you. And so in tandem with this idea of kind of looking at slavery and how Black contemporary playwrights are attempting to kind of talk about ongoing conditions of unfreedom, I feel like the theater is working in terms of how Black playwrights are using it to interrogate the question of citizenship. And it's highly important to kind of look at these histories, because this has been a long legacy of this work. I have here an image of Mary Baraka's slave ship as well as August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean. And both of those plays are doing critical work in interrogating just what it means to be a Black citizen, and trying to make that word mean something to Black people. I'm also thinking about plays beyond these. For example, Claudia Rankine's work, and also Fairview. Like, there are so many ways that contemporary Black artists are doing these kind of critical interrogations. And for me, I'm highly intrigued by theater as a gathering space that can do some critical work around anti-racism. Mary Baraka's protest theater gives us a roadmap in many ways to think about what kind of positive action can come out of going into the theater space, collecting with people, and being mobilized after that in order to impact society. And I kind of come back to, Toni Morrison in this sense, where she talks about one of the things she lamented about her novel, The Bluest Eye, is that people read it and they were touched but not moved, is what she said. And I'm wondering to what extent we in the theater need to be thinking about how to move people rather than touch them, right? That they can come into the theater and absorb trauma, but what do they do with that energy after the performance is over? Do we take it in and consume it? Or are we actually enacting a kind of anti-racist praxis beyond it? And so I think about that kind of civic engagement with the theater as full of possibility, but only if we harness it.
Thanks so much, Stacie. I really appreciate your framing on, especially thinking about the potential of this gathering space that theater is. I'm going to turn over this question about thinking about Black theater and citizenship to Wend.
Great, thank you. I think I'm experiencing a similar thing that Stacie experienced. It feels like I'm in conversation with myself. So hopefully I could just augment some stuff and punch phrase a few things here and there. So in this question, I'm thinking about a quote by Susan Lori Parks in her essay, Possession, where she says, this is the first slide, thank you. Since history is recorded or remembered event, theater for me is the perfect place to make history. That is because much of African-American history has been unrecorded, dismembered, washed out. One of my tasks as a playwright is to, through literature and the special, strange relationship between theater and real life, locate the ancestral burial ground, dig for bones, find bones, hear the bones sing, write it down. Earlier, she states, theater is a place which best allows me to figure out how the world works. And I'm interested in this notion of recreating out of fragments and shining black light on things that are covered up, unseen, forgotten, yet still living full lives in our memory or our rememory, as Toni Morrison would have it. And its connection to the strange relationship between theater and real life. I think it's a generative way to think about Black theater and its relationship to dominant orders of knowledge and ways of being and concepts like citizen. Park says theater is a place which best allows her to figure out how the world works. What does it mean to figure out how the world works if we perceive and experience the world as anti-Black? Is it not such figuring out, such studying, such refiguring the working of an anti-Black world, a reoccurring theme in many works of Black playwrights? And inside slide 4. Citizenship is the status of a person recognized under the law of a country and or local jurisdiction of belonging to thereof. I got that from Merriam-Webster. So when I think of Black theater and citizenship, I'm also reminded of a sample from Webb Du Bois when he describes the feeling of two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And Sylvia Wynter explains Du Bois' statement here as an attempt to, quote, come to grips with his own double consciousness that made it difficult for him to be an American without also being anti-Negro. That's from how we mistook the map for the territory, her article. So is Du Bois getting at a tension, perhaps an antagonism that bumps up against the limitations inherent in the concept of citizenship? What haunts the baggage of the guaranteed bundle of rights offered to those who are said to belong, those recognized as citizens? Is Black theater perhaps the space where artists and audience wrestle with alternative possibilities, other embodiments beyond of what it might mean to be American without being anti-Negro or anti-Black? Slide 5. And the last sample is from a book that was already mentioned by Claudia Rankins, Citizen, an American Lyric. And I heard that it had a theatrical premiere here in Seattle. Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to see it. But towards the end of that book, Citizen, is the following haunting exchange and harsh realization. And I quote it: "Come on, get back in the car. Your partner wants to face off with a mouth, and who knows what handheld object the other vehicle carries. Trayvon Martin's name sounds from the car radio a dozen times each half hour. You pull your love back into the seat because though no one seems to be chasing you, the justice system has other plans. Yes, and this is how you are a citizen. Come on, let it go, move on. Come on, let it go, move on." Can we imagine Black theater and all its manifestations as a space to hold on, to dig in the holes of history, to remain in the hold, to hold together before, as it seems we are always required, to let it go? Or like Citizen Barlow in Wilson's Gem of the Ocean, can it be a place of continuously staging the demands as well as reimagining the journeys to see Aunt Esther, to look upon the city of bones, to hear the bones sing and write it down? The business of theater always seems to be on the go. Can our theater provide a needed pause, a break? Can we tarry in the enormity of it all and breathe before we are forced to move on? Thank you.
Thanks, Wend. And I really appreciate you invoking Citizen. I'm thinking about Sound Theaters. I think it was their 2019 amazing production staging of Claudia Rakein's work. And I've taught this book, I always think of the line, "You are not the guy and still you fit the description," because there's only one guy who is always the guy fitting the description, and the ways in which meanings are placed on Black people's body and what that means for theater. So I really appreciate how you're thinking about these frames of citizenships, belonging, for Black people and Black theater. So our third and final question is, where do we go from here? And I'm thinking of Martin Luther King's speech, where do we go from here as well? And I'll turn it over first to Wend.
Great, thank you. I don't have too much to say. I'm hopeful that we're always doing the work, and sometimes we forget that we're in a long tradition of people who have always pushed back in order to push forward. But I think one thing I want to evoke is this notion of kind of creating not only the creative work on the stage, but the kind of hermeneutics, the theories of interpretation to help us understand what playwrights are doing, or dancers, or any type of artists producing art. And I think one thing I'm always reminded of is a conversation with a friend of mine and a mentor, Dr. J. Austin Williams, who always said we need to continually develop the theories, the dramatic theories of our own plays. And that's in a long line of tradition back to Amri Baraka and before that. But I think we still need to force that kind of approach to actually embed not only our physical bodies, our performative, but also our perspectives and our critical force into the kind of zeitgeist of the institution. So I just want to end with just reading her quote from her article. "It is within the Black feminist dramatic, and in concert with the ever-expanding constellation of Black scholars and scholar artists, that my waking hours are spent analyzing and meditating upon not the hope or promise of some event horizon, but upon the Black dramas within which we might imagine the undoing of what the prospect of that event has already unmade. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And I'll turn it over to Stacie. Where do we go from here?
Yes. I was thinking about a few things that I just wanted to highlight, and something that is currently I'm sitting with as we look at all the ways that capital continues to circumscribe our lives, and all the things that we are invested in, or at least the things they want us to be invested in. And so I'm very adamant that we have to work to change that equation. We have to find a way to get out of the same kind of formulaic ways of engaging Blackness, thinking Blackness, representing Blackness that has so thoroughly limited in many ways people's imagination. We also have to retain the expressive force of Black theater and not sanitize it. I think there's a real risk, especially when we are thinking about commercial issues, that we risk going towards something that might make audiences comfortable versus work that is actually invoking something. I think about August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean that had a shortened run because audiences couldn't handle the confrontation of the Middle Passage scene and express extreme discomfort around kind of having to confront, say, the aftermath of 9/11 and that memorialization, but the lack of memorialization of the millions of lives lost in Middle Passage. And so what does it mean to support and engage theater that might not necessarily be profitable? And in that way, we have to guard against the commodification of Blackness that is often sometimes at the heart of our calculations, kind of thinking about formulas around which plays we support, which plays we engage, and also continue to harness the power of theater's world making, a space to imagine otherwise. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Aaliyah and Underland and how much that play is giving us a path for that. And when your work is just really inspirational in doing some of that theorizing, I think, that you even referenced in your own remarks. So kind of thinking about how that otherwise can lead us toward a path of liberation.
Thanks so much, Stacie. So with that, I want to first, and actually I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you all and be in this space with you all. First, I just want to give it up for our amazing panelists. We have about 10-15 minutes for questions, but I'd love just to give folks a round of applause. This has been immensely generative, selfishly for me, and I hope productively for all of you all in this audience. I'd love to open it up for questions. I think the best way is for folks to put in the chat if they have a question. And I guess I will, maybe I'll kind of just to stall for time as folks might be asking questions. I love to hear, oh, thanks, Kathy. I'd love to hear Stacie and Wynn, just from you two being in dialogue here, if anything came up for you in this conversation today, just kind of being in dialogue with each other here.
Wend, I was going to let you go, but go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to act like my camera froze, so you.
Okay, right. I just am really taken by what you were talking about looking with and not looking at, because I think about the kind of politics of visuality and the ways that the gaze has been so violent for Black people. And so I'm wondering, how do we arrive at a different way of looking, and what is our responsibility when we are engaging with Blackness on stage to do that looking with?
Thank you for that. Thank you for taking that up. I hope that wasn't a good question for me to answer. But no, just thank you for that kind of thinking about that formulation. If I can bounce one back. I was really moved with some of those quotes you brought in, especially the Angela Davis one There's kind of the difference that makes no difference. I'm thinking of Amri Barker as the changing same. That is like the appearance of difference and progress, but still the structures are still there. But also when you said move from, what was it? Just touching to
or for being touched, from being touched but not moved, the way people responded to the bluest eye. Yeah.
And I think that's powerful, this notion of the sentimental of kind of Black suffering without the kind of critical engagements of the systemic oppressive mechanisms that make that possible. And I'm always very cautious of that. How do we portray Black suffering on stage where it doesn't become this type of consumption and pleasure? So thank you for that.
This is really, really great and generative. And yes, all of these quotes, that kind of idea of being moved and not touched, or touched and not moved, I think was really, really productive. I see in the chat, Lenore, it is being recorded and we will communicate about kind of how to access. Thank you also, Wendell and Stacie, for being okay with being recorded. Because I think I'm really happy it's being recorded. It's such a productive conversation. I think a question I have for you both, and I encourage folks to put questions in the chat, is Wendell, you talked really beautifully about thinking about hermeneutics. Like, I really appreciated how you talked about these maybe two framings of hip hop theater. We can think about hip hop theater through style, right? We can think about perhaps someone rapping on stage. We also can think about the critical consciousness of hip hop and what that like lends to theater. And what is the hermeneutics? What are the kind of ways in which we frame approaching theater? I'd love to hear from you both. What are questions that audience might have? What are productive questions that we might ask a white audience, a Black audience, a multiracial audience, a multi-generational audience to have when engaging Black theater? What questions might we want audiences to think about when engaging Black people on stage, Black stories on stage?
I think for me, one of the things is kind of, we talk about kind of going through recognizing biases or expectations. I feel like in some ways we have to be critical in recognizing what we might expect to go see and how what we're seeing tracks with what we're actually seeing. Because I think that so often, and I think, you can't control how people interpret your work, but projection is real. And kind of one of the things about theater that I find so compelling is that it does kind of force a certain kind of listening. But I think we often always have to monitor just what ways we're interpreting what we're hearing. And that we aren't projecting what we want to see onto something versus what actually is being given to us, and how to be open to that experience. That feels like an important question, I think, audience members should ask, especially when you're engaging with, a Black play that you're kind of already deciding this is what it's about, and I'm going to go see it, and you come out saying that's what it was about, and that might not have been what it was about. So I think that that's a really important question. So that's one thing that came to mind.
That's great. Thank you for the question, and of course, Stacie, for that answer. I'm interested in kind of thinking about this notion of picking up what Stacie said, bringing kind of a perception, a cognitive schema already to something, whether it's literary analysis, whether it's kind of liberal universalism that you bring upon it, and not maybe letting the play think for itself, and trying to track the long line of kind of subversion that has always been a part of like Black cultural expression. So this kind of notion of what is it maybe doing outside, against, alongside liberal universalism, outside, against, alongside capitalism, Marxism, all these kind of things. So I'm interested in kind of thinking about that, and again, find people that can come in and talk about the work it's doing on the B side of these concepts.
I really appreciate that framing, Stacie and Wend. I think thinking about these, Wend, and I hear you saying thinking about these different currents, because I think also there's sometimes a move, and Stacie, you know, my dear friend, scholar Raisa Williams often talks about how there's often a move to be like, oh, we're always resisting. We're always resisting this or resisting that, or Black people are always resisting. But what does it mean to think about Black people with certain currents, or Black people with and against, or kind of these nuances versus always kind of a resistance to things?
It feels kind of familiar. I think that the other thing that, you know, I am always trying to disrupt is this idea of Blackness is knowable, that you know, we can recognize it, that it's something that we can contain, something we can control. And that kind of embracing of illegibility, we just don't get to because people think they already know. And I think that resistance is one of those impulses, right, to kind of frame Blackness rather than just existing or engaging in other things. So yeah.
That's really great, Stacie. We're gonna go a few minutes over time because I want to get to some of these questions. I'll read Monique. Monique asks, so many aspects of our Blackness have been appropriated and commodified. How do we present Black theater without offering our Blackness for consumption?
Wendell, I'm gonna let you take this one first.
I don't have a good answer, and I have a pessimistic answer. I think one way is to think rather than a fixedness, rather than a boundary or a frame, to think more fluidity or fugitivity. I don't think there's any way that you can stop co-optation. I think what you can do, as Mos Def says, by the time you get where I'm standing, I'll be gone. I think you can have that kind of moving away from the thing that the dominant culture is commodifying at the time. And you're like, oh, we haven't said you go girl since 1982. We're on to something else. So for me, it's fugitivity and flight. I don't think there's a way you can stand there and say, this is mine, and it's not going to be swiped out from under you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that that's why I've been so intrigued by the way that these playwrights are writing against the expectation and refusing legibility, and actually giving a sense of the unexpected as a space to enter something that is more authentically true to that play. And that, you know, I think one of the ways that we present Black theater without offering Blackness as a consumption is to refuse the consumption, right? And to think about ways to get around and force audience discomfort, that Afro alienation that Daphne Brooks talks about, right? And force audiences to be uncomfortable with you, and to even push past legibility in the most provocative ways. So that there's a kind of work that the audience has to do, as opposed to this kind of distance gazing that often happens.
That's great. I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions. They're all really fabulous, but I really appreciate you all being here. I'm going to ask this question from Orion, who says, thank you all so much for your time, wisdom, insight, and artistry. What changes do you feel can/should be made to programming outside of shows themselves, talkbacks, extra events, education programming, community dialogue, etc., to foster proactive and equitable social shifts, expanded awareness, real unifying of people?
One of the things I see here I'm thinking about is I teach at a theater program that's in a university that's heavily white. And I engage with many theater students who are desperately looking for mentors, opportunities. I think we need to invest more in bringing people into the space at every level, but especially in encouraging our student actors, our playwrights, funding them, funding their work. Because in many ways, what happens is we get into these really high-minded discussions that often are not actually resulting in change material circumstances so that people can get the opportunities and be able to have access in ways that, you know, they don't currently have. And so I think beyond this, beyond the community dialogue, I think about how can we make these spaces more accessible and supportive for people who are not always in positions of power. How do we bring more people in power sharing so that boards, so that the playwrights, the people who are deciding, you know, all of these things around funding, that they reflect people who are invested in wanting to truly engage in transformation.
Thanks, Stacie. Wen, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think that's great. Some of the things that this person asked a question on important talkbacks, extra events, education. I think some type of, Stacie mentioned, some type of mentorship where you actually come in, do fellowships, that you actually kind of embed yourself into the institution rather than being kind of migratory labor as you move from theater to theater. And the other thing is just, I think space, for me, like space is really important. I think there's a reason why it's so hard to get together and create. I don't think that's an accident. And I think when we do, not only do we get to kind of feed our soul, but we get to kind of rethink about why we're here and how do we remix tradition and move forward.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Let's all give amazing round of applause to our amazing panelists, Stacey McCormick, Wendell Woods. We're so really grateful for your presence, your wisdom, your time. I want to just briefly also kind of give a shout out to Intiman Theater. I became board president in November of last year. And so I encourage folks to reach out to me. My email address is boardchair@intiman.org. And also the board is growing right now. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, feel free to contact me. Also, we encourage you to support Intiman Theater, intiman.org/donate. Also, I want to just give another shout out to Stacey McCormick's amazing book, Staging Black Fugitivity, and Wendell Woods' amazing play, Aaliyah and Underland. Please check it out. And so one more round of thank you for amazing panelists. Thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate you, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.